Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of our lecture on Missouri and Kansas and the Civil War. Today we are going to look at the guerrilla fighting that took place, and we will also see the second half of the war in Missouri and the last attempts by the Confederacy to actually take hold of those Union strongholds. And we'll see, in fact, a very major battle at the Battle of Westport that was often called the Gettysburg of the West. So once again, some very important moments happening here. Again, I alluded to this scene behind me, this painting that was done called Order Number 11. We will discuss that today and the horrendous war that plagued the citizens of Missouri during this time with this horrendous order. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me get the screen pulled up here. And again, I hope you can see there that first link. We are going to begin by talking about some of the guerrilla fighting that was occurring in Missouri and Kansas throughout the war. The guerrilla fighting was nothing new. We had seen guerrilla fighting against Union forces. We'd seen raids into Kansas. We had seen those continue basically into Jackson County, actually becoming a refuge for bushwhackers, a term we learned in our last unit. So basically you have these raids going back and forth between Missouri and Kansas. That is still continuing. So this had to be solved. There had to be an issue because Kansas kept falling under attack, and it was pro-Southerners from Missouri doing the violence, and it just led to more and more revenge. So eventually there was a decision made in which the Union general, a man named Thomas Ewing, E-W-I-N-G, Thomas Ewing, was placed in charge of basically this district, the western part of Missouri and the eastern part of Kansas. It's called the District of the Border. And he will control this area, basically using martial law to try and bring it back into the Union fold to make sure that violence is diminished. And of course, he has to solve this issue of these bushwhackers going over into Kansas. So he's going to take some pretty drastic action throughout these options that are being decided. Well, he basically called for arrest of anyone who was aiding the bushwhackers going over into Kansas. And that meant anyone. And so not only did a lot of men, of course, get arrested for this, but there were actually a number of women that were arrested as well, giving supplies to these bushwhackers. And I'm talking about men like Quantrell and his raiders. Guys that were going over and attacking on the regular. They were often coming back to Jackson County in particular, finding refuge, staying there, getting a warm meal before they would go back over and commit more violence. Well, some of the people that were arrested, as I said, were women, and including some of Quantrell's female relatives. Now, tragedy did strike because these women were being held in basically a makeshift prison. And on August 14th, this building collapsed and it killed 4 women inside, including the sister of one of Quantrell's most famous raiders, and that was Bloody Bill Anderson. Later on, Bloody Bill Anderson, citing revenge of this prison collapse, would go on to lead one of the worst massacres ever seen in Missouri history, known as the Centralia Massacre, in which he basically forced 24 Union soldiers off of a railroad train, and 100 others. There was kind of a Union militia there in Centralia, and basically lined them up and killed them all. He murdered all of them, almost 150 people there. So, this is a good reminder that a lot of the Missouri-Kansas struggle is all about revenge, right? It is all about revenge, and one act of violence leading directly to another act of violence. I'm going to leave this page really quick. I want to share out another page with you, and I'm going to pull up Google Maps here. And hopefully this is still recording on your side. But right here, you have the Sprint Center. If you're familiar with downtown, we're at the corner of Truman and Grand. So kind of spin around here a little bit. You got I-70 running underneath that bridge right there. You can see the Kansas City Star building. Well, if you've ever been down this way, you may have noticed a marker that is located at this corner. And if we zoom in, we can't see all of it, but we can see there that it says the Union Prison collapse. This is in fact the exact site of where that Union prison was held. This includes Quantrell's Raiders family. And again, this is the site of where it collapsed. So next time you're at a concert at the Sprint Center, as you're walking there, maybe try to find this marker and think about how events in this location directly led to more violence during the Civil War. The history never truly leaves us. Well, as a result of the prison collapse, Quantrell would renew his efforts and fully engage the city of Lawrence, Kansas, on August 21st, 1863. Quantrell would lead another raid of Lawrence. Remember, we've already seen Lawrence burn to the ground, the sacking of Lawrence, but this time Lawrence is going to be even more violently attacked. It's not just about the buildings. Quantrell is out for revenge, and when he and his men invade the town, they basically he tells his men to round up all of the men that are old enough to hold a rifle. That is a direct quote. If they are old enough to hold a rifle, basically bring them out here in the street. The youngest was 14, younger than most of the audience listening from my class. And the oldest was 90. And a total of 183 men were lined up, and one by one, they were executed by Quantrell and his men. Almost 200 souls lost that day, and most of which, of course, had nothing to do with any of the fighting that was taking place. Just happened to make Lawrence, Kansas, their home. This is kind of a last straw for the Union leadership. This kind of violence, just wanton murder, is too much. And so one of the harshest orders that has ever been passed down in American history came down the pipeline, August 25th, 1863, called Order Number 11. In response to the violent attack on Lawrence, the Union General Thomas Ewing issued perhaps the most brutal order of the entire war, effectively forcing all citizens of Jackson, Bates, Cass, and Vernon County, and basically everyone who lived south of Brush Creek, and also those that lived a mile outside of cities of Independence, Hickman Mills, Pleasant Hill, Harrisonville. It ordered every single person that applied to, so thousands of people we're talking about, and said, you have 15 days to leave your home. Okay? They were not taking any more chances. They were not going to allow these Confederate raiders to have anyone else sheltering them. They gave them 15 days to leave their homes. If they chose to stay in the county, they had to give a loyalty oath, but many refused to do that. Even though they would have gotten a certificate if they had given the oath that allowed them to live within the military stations within each county, many of them did not, in fact, give that oath. And many stayed in their homes. The result are the scenes below. You have, in fact, I'm going to go to the next page here. Yep. So the famous picture that painted behind me. This was done by a man named George Caleb Bingham. I'll talk about him in a second. And this is a pretty brutal scene. You have a young man who's been shot and dead. Looks like a young woman, maybe shot and dead there in the foreground. You also have an older man pleading with these red legs to stop these brutal attacks. So what was actually happening that led to such violence? Well, as you can imagine, most people did not go quietly. And when the 15 days were up, Ewing ordered his men, made up of both Union regulars, but also Kansas militia, and this is where we get into some of the problems. The Redlegs, most of the men enforcing Order Number 11 were Kansans, and this is their opportunity for revenge. They are going to not only burn homes of basically every home in the Jackson County, and again, all those counties I mentioned earlier. Not only are they're going to burn all those homes, they will also take the supplies or ruin the supplies, and many people are killed during this period as well. I don't have it in my notes, but I actually, again, if you're watching from Lee Summit, the middle school is named Pleasant Lee. I believe Pleasant Lee was actually killed by Redlegs on his front lawn, and I can't remember if it was due to this order or I believe it might have been earlier in the war. But this kind of violence was sporadic, and it happened a lot. Now, today, fast forward 2020, we really don't have many Civil War homes in Jackson County and the surrounding areas. This is why they were all burned to the ground during this time. In fact, they became the whole area becomes known as the Burnt District, and they become known as Jennison's tombstones. One of the Union captains that was in charge of leading the burning of these basically became infamous here, because you would be walking down the road and you would see a chimney stack that was sitting out in a field by itself, and you knew that the home had been burned by Jennison and his men. So the brutality of this order really had an opposite effect than what the Union wanted, because anybody that had been neutral before really will vilify the Union forces, and eventually there's so much backlash that the Union actually does repeal the order in January of 1864. They do repeal the order. The final note I want to give on this is about George Caleb Bingham and this painting. George Caleb Bingham was actually a very bitter enemy of Thomas Ewing, who had issued this order. He sent a letter to Ewing, saying that if you execute this, and this is a direct quote, if you execute this order, I shall make you infamous with pen and brush. I will read you a little quote from Bingham as to what he said after he published the painting that you see before you. This is a direct quote. "It is well known that men were shot down in the very act of obeying the order, and their wagons and effects seized by their murderers. Large trains of wagons, extending over the prairies for miles in length and moving Kansasward, were freighted with every description of household furniture, and wearing apparel belonging to the exiled inhabitants. Dense columns of smoke, arising in every direction, marked the conflagration of dwellings, many of the evidences of which were yet to be seen in the remains of seared and blackened chimneys, standing as melancholy monuments of a ruthless military despotism which spared neither age, sex, character, nor condition. There was neither aid nor protection afforded to these banished inhabitants by the heartless authority which expelled them from their rightful possessions. They crowded by hundreds upon the banks of the Missouri River, and were indebted to the charity of benevolent steamboat conductors for transportation to places of safety where friendly aid could be extended to them without danger to those who ventured to contribute it." A terrible day in the history of Missouri, and one that saw, this is a part of a much bigger issue of what's happening in the Civil War. The Civil War has become a total war, and I want you to write that term down: total war. This is not a limited engagement. This is not just battlefield skirmishes that are happening. This is a war that is being taken to the people, and we are going to see this even more so towards the end of the war with what the Union is doing in parts of the South with Sherman's March to the Sea. It is a total war. You bring the war to the people that you believe have started it, attacking civilians, giving no quarter. All of these tactics are going to be used with more brutality later on. And I also want to allude to the fact that this is another major obstacle following the war. The North and South do not just instantly get along after the war ends. This is one of those major dividing points, is the brutality that was demonstrated upon Southerners. Now, according to Union generals, and we'll quote a few, Sheridan and Sherman, they wanted them to feel the war. They did that on purpose. They wanted the effects of the war to be felt in the South, where they believed the war had begun. It was not the Northerners that brought this upon them. It was them bringing it upon themselves. So a good reminder that war is full of atrocities, and that often the ones that actually pay in war are the normal citizens like you and me. Okay, it is not purely the soldiers. It is not the politicians ever, but it is almost always the civilians, just the average everyday people. Now, by 1864, this is the point that we have reached. We have seen now that the Confederates have kind of lost some momentum, and Price is finally getting his wish of returning back into Missouri, leading a raid into Missouri, and this is going to be the last last opportunity we see of them taking control of Missouri. By 1864, the war has changed a lot. The South is becoming increasingly desperate. Grant has begun to turn the tide on Lee out east, and the Western theater is frankly not faring doing any better. You can see some of the battles there. Once the waterways were controlled by the Union, in 1863, it really made it difficult for the Confederacy to survive. So they're quite desperate by this point. The main purpose of this, look at the date here that we're looking at these raids, late 1864. 1864 is an election year. It is a presidential election year. You better believe that the Confederates understand that, and they're willing to push this issue to try and get people to vote Lincoln out of office. And there, in fact, were. In fact, I think McClellan is the other candidate running in 1864 and offering to try and meet the Confederacy halfway. It was a somewhat appealing idea to people that were tired of 4 years of war. So, this is kind of what's happening. This is the last push in this theater to try and get some momentum for the Confederacy. And ultimately, as we're going to see, it is all, of course, for naught. Well, Price will have about 12,000 men in his army of the Missouri. And as you can imagine, the supplies were low. Many of Price's men lack water jugs, ammunition. Many of them even lack shoes. So this is definitely a ragtag army by this point, and that was going on all across all theaters. It was the Confederacy and their frankly lack of supplies. Well, the Price thought that the people of Missouri would frankly rise up and join them. It didn't happen. All right. As we talked about before, I think the Confederate pro-Southern forces really overestimated how many Confederate sympathizers there were in Missouri. That's a lot of immigrants, a lot of Irish, a lot of German immigrants. The demographics have changed, and people do not want to be part of the Confederacy. So, even though Price is going to lead these raids, the people do not rise up with him. They do not join the great struggle. And obviously, it does not work out for the Confederacy. First, Price is going to head towards St. Louis, but frankly, he realizes it's way too strong to take. You can see there at Pilot Knob, which we won't even discuss, but heading up towards Jefferson City. Basically, they find that Jefferson City, St. Louis, heavily defended by the Union. They're not going to be able to take it. The next best place, Jackson County, Kansas City, and particularly a city that is today in Kansas City called Westport. Okay, now the Battle of Westport. Here you have General Price attacking the Union line, made up of Union General Samuel Curtis. His forces have dug in at Westport. This is one of the largest battles in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. 30,000 men engaged in this battle. In fact, some of the men that are fighting here would become very famous names later on, including men like Buffalo Bill Cody. He's at the Battle of Westport. Wild Bill Hickok. There's you might remember the old stories of mountain men, but Jeremiah Johnson was one of these early explorers and trappers, and Jeremiah Johnson is fighting in this battle as well. The battle lasted for 4 hours. There were multiple assaults, and ultimately Curtis's men held their ground and suffered heavy casualties, but still were able to hold their ground, and Price had to withdraw. The Battle of Westport, given its sheer size in this theater, became known as the Gettysburg of the West. And it effectively ended Price's campaign. You can see that from here on out, they're going to be heading south. Got the Battle of Mine Creek coming up, but from this point on, they're going to be either in Oklahoma or Arkansas. This is the last time the Confederacy will threaten Missouri at all. And, one side effect that I think is very important, and I'm dealing with the results here, one unintended side effect is that resistance in Missouri is going to be much less after this raid because, I mentioned early on Price thinking, well, we'll get a lot of volunteers as we sweep through. There were some, but not the vast majority of people that he thought were going to rise up with him. But the unintended consequence is that those that did join up with Price as he swept through Missouri, many of them were guerrillas. They had been fighting against Union forces as guerrilla fighters the entire war. And basically with this, he kind of sweeps them all up. And so Missouri's really kind of cleared of all the guerrilla fighters, them thinking that if they joined Price, this was like the last big push, and it failed. So all of Missouri's guerrillas are either killed or they have left the state, as Price was basically run out by Union forces. So this will be the last time we discuss, at least until later on. But the war had a horrible effect in Missouri, and one of the most brutal moments of the entirety of the war, but just in American history in general. Guys, as always, please do not hesitate to communicate with me if you have any questions, comments. Feel free to either leave them below in the video, or as always, you can email me. Thanks for stopping by.